This aircraft was one of the heroes of the Battle of Britain, and though it didn't get as much time in the spotlight as the stylish Spitfire, actually it was responsible for the bigger half of German losses over Britain. It was a modern monoplane fighter of its time, but it still used traditional building methods and served all through World War II. So let's see the history of the Hawker Hurricane. Though the development of monoplanes started to gather momentum in the late 1920s and early 1930s, many were still skeptical about them. This was the view amongst the Royal Air Force staff and in the Air Ministry as well, as many felt the current biplanes are well suited for their roles, and since there were no boomers faster than them, it was not worth gambling on some new unproven technology. Well, soon they were proved wrong, and by one of their own aircraft. The plane in question was the Hawker Hart, which was developed as an answer to a ministry specification in 1926 for a new light bomber aircraft. Though the specifications only asked for 160 miles an hour speed, the Hart, after it made its maiden flight, reached 167 miles an hour. The production aircraft featuring the new Rolls-Royce Kestrel 1B engine was even faster, and it reached 184 miles an hour maximum speed. This was quite a shock for many, as most contemporary biplane fighters in the RAF only had a maximum speed between 155 and 175 miles an hour. The ministry decided they need to set new specifications for a new faster fighter aircraft. This led to the ministry specification F730, which requested a new fighter plane featuring 4 machine guns and have at least 250 miles an hour speed. Though it wasn't required, the use of the new Rolls-Royce Goshawk engine was encouraged. The designs entered for these specifications were the Blackburn F3, the Bristol Type 123 and 133, the Gloucester SS, the Hawker PV3, the Supermarine Type 224, the Westland F730, and later the Gloucester Gladiator. Eventually the Gloucester Gladiator won this competition, though Gloucester entered it late, and by the time it flew in September 1934, it was clearly outdated. Even before this competition ended, it was clear the results can only be stopgaps. By that time the biplanes reached their maximum potential, and all over the world, but especially in Germany, new monoplanes were in development, which were much faster than the current biplane fighters. I have made videos on many of these designs, which all were developed to be faster than the contemporary fighters, like the Heinkel HG111, the Dornier DO17, the Junkers Ju-88, or the Italian SM-79 Sparviero. If you would like to learn about their history, check out these videos on the channel. It was clear the RAF needed a new breed of modern high-speed fighter. The development of the Hurricane actually started as a private venture at Hawker, when their chief designer Sidney Kemp drawn up the initial design in 1934. He discussed the possibilities of new monoplane designs with Major John Buchanan at the Directorate of Technical Development. The first plans of the Fury monoplane very much looked like its predecessor, the Hawker Fury, with one wing removed and using the Goshawk engine. But these plans were rejected by the ministry. In late 1934, the power plant was changed to the new Rolls-Royce PV-12 engine, which later became known as the famous Merlin. But not only the power plant changed, the design was reworked to such extent they dropped the Fury name and now it was just called Monoplane Interceptor. The fixed undercarriage was also dropped and the new retractable landing gear design was implemented. Meanwhile, the F534 ministry specification, released in November 1934, asked for 6 or 8 machine guns on all new fighter planes. Though Hawker made design modifications to fit their fighter for these specifications, they continued working on the original plan as well, which featured only 4 machine guns, 2 in the nose and 2 in the wings, as it was in far too advanced stage to abandon. The plans were shown to the ministry, and the result was the F-36-34 specification to cover this type, which in July 1935 was then modified to include the requirements for 8 machine guns. The first mock-up of the new Hawker plane was built by the end of 1934, and the first indicated performance figures showed 330 miles an hour maximum speed and a service ceiling of 32,500 feet. Hawker received a contract from the Air Ministry to build a prototype, but since the number and type of the armament was still in question, it was decided the prototype for the time being will be just fitted with ballast weights for the trials. Since the specifications were finalized in July and requested 8 machine guns, the contract was also modified to present the prototype with ballast equaling 4 Browning machine guns in each wing. By the end of August, the airframe was completed, and by October the prototype K5083 was fully assembled, and on 6th of November it made its maiden flight. By March the next year, the early trials were finished and no major problems were found. The prototype managed to reach 315 miles an hour speed at 16,000 feet, and it was praised by the pilots as an easy-to-fly aircraft. One problem surfaced during further testing, however. The Hurricane had very poor characteristics recovering from a spin, but luckily the aerodynamic problem causing this was found relatively early, and from the 61st production aircraft, a ventral fairing was added and a bottom extension on the rudder. Based on the positive test results, the Air Ministry placed an order for 600 production aircraft in June 1936 and approved the name Hurricane. The production of the Hurricane was relatively fast and required less man-hours than the Spitfire, thanks to its simple and proven construction, very similar to the earlier Fury design. The prototype was fitted with armament in August 1936 and continued its test flights. A bit more than a year later, in October 1937, the first production aircraft made its maiden flight, though production was delayed because the power plant was changed from the original Merlin 1 engine to the new Merlin 2. The first production Hurricane started to arrive to their units in December 1937. But the development of the aircraft didn't stop with the first production models, so let's take a look at its variants. The Hurricane Mark I was the original production version, still featuring fabric-covered wings, which were adopted initially to speed up production. This variant used the Merlin 2 or later the Merlin 3 engines, and featured 8 7.7mm machine guns in the wings. The Mark I was revised at the end of 1939 and received metal-covered wings in place of the fabric-covered ones, constant speed propellers, and other improvements. The following Mark II-A variant used the improved Merlin 20 engines, which featured a 2-stage supercharger. To accommodate the bigger engine, the Mark II was 4.5 inches longer than its predecessor. These variants entered service in September 1940. The Mark II-B variant had improved firepower, with additional 4 machine guns, bringing the total to 12, and it was able to carry 250 or 500-pound bombs. They were used in ground attack missions mostly. The following Mark II-C variant was a big upgrade for the type. Even though carrying 8 and later 12 machine guns, the destructive power of the 7.7mm weapons was very lackluster. So as early as 1939, there were ideas of using 20mm cannons instead of machine guns. During the Battle of Britain, however, the quick manufacturing of fighters was more important than development. Hawker only got permission to use a pair of battle-damaged wings for trials for the cannon conversion. But towards the end of 1940, the project picked up, and 4 airframes using the Merlin 20 engines were converted to carry cannons, and served as prototypes for the Mark II-C variant. They first flew in February 1941, and the production Mark II-Cs started to enter service in May. They also featured hardpoints to carry bombs, and since their performance at the time was lacking against the newest German fighters, they were used in ground attack missions. The C variant was the most produced Hurricane, with 4,751 built. The following Mark II-D version was an anti-tank variant, carrying 2 40mm cannons under the wings, and featuring additional armor around the engine and cockpit. The Mark II-E version was again fitted with external bomb racks, but since the modifications interfered with the maintenance and electrical wiring in the wings, a new wing was designed by Hawker. The use of the new universal wing, which could carry either bombs, 40mm cannons or drop tanks, resulted in the variant renamed to Mark IV, while the Mark III naming was reserved to Hurricane airframes that used the US-built Packard engines. The last official production variant was the Mark V. Only one of them were purpose-built, and 2 others converted from Mark IVs. This variant was planned to use the 1,700 horsepower Merlin 32 engines, but the test showed the new engine brought little advantage, so this variant was cancelled. The Mark 10, 11 and 12 were naming used for Canadian-built aircraft. The different versions modified for the Royal Navy were the Sea Hurricanes. starting with the Mark Ia version, which was modified to be used on the so-called cam ships, as defense against German planes attacking the convoys. These were launched from merchant ships, but after the combat, the pilot had to ditch the aircraft, or bail out, as the ships had no landing platforms. The Mark IB was built with catapult spools and a restore hook, to be used on carriers. The Mark IC was equipped with 4 cannons instead of machine guns. And the Mark IIC used the stronger Merlin 20 engines, developing 1460 horsepower. An interesting test version was the Hilson F-40. It was built to test the idea of a slipwing aircraft, which would take off as a biplane, then ditch the upper wings, and fly as a monoplane. After a few trials, this project was cancelled. The Hurricane was 32 feet 3 inches long, with a wingspan of 40 feet. The empty weight of the fighter was 5,745 pounds, and the maximum takeoff weight was 7,670 pounds. It used the Rolls-Royce Merlin 20 engine, producing 1,200 horsepower. With this power plant, it could reach a maximum speed of 340 miles an hour and a cruise speed of 238 miles an hour. The fighter had a range of 600 miles and a service ceiling of 36,000 feet. Its armament consisted of 4 20mm Hispano cannons, 2 in each wing, and it could carry 2 250 or 500-pound bombs. At the outbreak of World War II, 8 squadrons of the RAF were equipped with Hurricanes. 4 of these squadrons were sent to France in September 1939, though the French initially asked for 10 fighter squadrons, but that would have depleted the RAF too much. The Hurricanes first saw combat in October 1939 over the North Sea, when they shot down 5 Heinkel 115 flying boats. Their first kill over the continent happened at the end of the month, when a Hurricane shot down a DO-17 reconnaissance plane. Though these early months of the war didn't see heavy air activity over France, in December 2 Hurricanes were lost, when a flight was jumped by 4 Bf-109s. As the Battle of France started in May 1940, 3 additional squadrons joined the initial 4 in France, and not long after, all 10 requested Hurricane squadrons fought in France. Following the light activity at the end of 1939, suddenly the fighting was fierce and very heavy. In 1 week, almost 60 Hurricanes were lost, but they took a heavy toll on the Germans, destroying nearly twice as much of their planes. The heavy fighting continued on the following days, and on 20th of May, the Hurricane squadrons were ordered to return to England. During the 11 days of fighting, the Hurricane pilots claimed almost 500 kills, and though these numbers are somewhat inflated, they did destroy at least 300 German planes. They participated in the evacuation at Dunkirk as well, and again the fighting against the Luftwaffe was fierce, as the RAF lost 177 aircraft, and the Germans lost almost 240. Of course, the most famous battle the Hurricanes fought was the Battle of Britain, from the beginning of July until the end of October 1940. At the beginning of the battle, 31 squadrons were equipped with Hurricanes, making up about 60% of the fighters facing the Germans. During the battle, usually the more nimble Spitfires were used against the enemy fighters, while the more numerous Hurricanes attacked the German bombers. Though the Hurricanes were slower than the German fighters and their climb rate was worse, they had a smaller turn radius, so if they got into a dogfight, the Hurricane was more than capable of taking on the Bf-109s. Still, the tactics to force the German fighters into combat by the Spitfires, and then attack the bombers with the Hurricanes, worked. Especially as the short-range German fighters only had a few minutes of fuel for actual dogfight over England, before they had to turn back home. During the Battle of Britain, the more powerful Hurricane Mark II versions also started to enter service, which was a welcomed update by the pilots. The German planes faced top-of-the-line modern fighters the first time since the war started, and it was a rude surprise for them that their bombers, doing so well in Poland, Norway, and in the Low Countries, and in the Battle of France, suddenly faced faster, well-armed fighters in numbers. During the Battle of Britain, the RAF lost 1,547 planes altogether, while the German losses were even higher, at 1,887 aircraft. The Hurricanes were accountable for shooting down 656 German planes. The Hurricanes also participated in the fighting in North Africa from 1940. Though with the arrival of the newer German Bf-109E variants, or the Italian Macchi MC-202 fighters, the Hurricanes lost their edge and were replaced by P-40 fighters in the air superiority role, but they were still used in ground attack missions. They also participated in the defense of Malta in 1940 and 41 against the Italian and German attacks. First, only 4 Hurricanes joined the island's defenders, then further 12 in August 1940. Additional 23 of them were moved to the island in April 1941. 51 Hurricanes originally intended for the Middle East were sent to Singapore when the war with Japan broke out. They arrived in January 1942 and saw action at the end of the month. They were heavily outnumbered by the Japanese forces and had a hard time fighting against the more nimble Japanese planes, but nonetheless they claimed several victories, though their losses were high as well. The Sea Hurricanes operating from the Royal Navy's carriers proved to be a very useful tool, protecting the convoys on the Mediterranean and on the Atlantic. The Hurricanes were also supplied to the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. Though many Soviet pilots thought the Hurricane was inferior to Soviet fighters, it took part in the defense of the Soviet Union from 1941 against the German forces. Many of them were modified with heavier armament by the Soviet mechanics, as they found the machine guns too weak against the German planes. Altogether, 2,952 Hurricanes were delivered to the Soviet Union during the war. The Hurricane, though it is mostly eclipsed by the more stylish Spitfire, was a very important fighter in World War II. It was almost as capable as the more famous Supermarine plane, but it was cheaper, easier to build, and more numerous. Though it was slowly replaced by the new Hawker Typhoons by 1944, some of them stayed in service until January 1947, when the last one of them was finally retired. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and in the comments let me know if there's any interesting events or vehicles you'd like to see.